We have all NBA teams. We have all-star teams, but a team that I'm going to be making today, or two teams actually, is going to be the all NBA underrated team and the all NBA overrated team. Going over a couple of players, basically giving you a starting lineup of guys that, once again, I believe are overrated or underrated in some way or another, with a couple of bench pieces, guys that I thought were worth mentioning, but they didn't really deserve the quote unquote starting spot on these rosters. But before we get into that, welcome to another episode of Jump Ball, your new daily dose of NBA news and opinions. I am, of course, your host, Sam Conrad. Let's get into today's episode. So the first player on my all NBA underrated team is a player that we talked a little bit about yesterday when we were talking about the Ben Simmons, future and some potential trades for him. And that's going to be Malcolm Brogdon. Now you can, of course, call me a little bit biased here. I am an Indiana Pacers fan, but I still do think, even if I wasn't a Pacers fan, that I would be calling this guy underrated. Because here's the thing. Malcolm Brogdon just 2 seasons ago shot 50, 40, 90, averaging almost, I believe it was 18.9 points a night and 7 assists or something along those lines. Just a very, very good stat line. Then he came to Indiana, had a bit of a down year, but he's definitely stepped it up, having potentially his best season yet last year, averaging about 21 points a game on some pretty good efficiency, not exactly 50, 40, 90, but definitely a more efficient score in the NBA overall. And something about a scoring that I think is a bit underrated, or something that's just not really talked about enough, is the fact that he can score a bit from all three levels. He's not exactly an elite mid-range scorer yet, but when he does take mid-range shots, he makes sure that they are pretty open looks. They are looks that he's comfortable with, and he's willing to take those shots, and he's going to make them a relatively high percentage of the time. Of course, he can just absolutely snipe it from 3-point range. He's not exactly, an off-ball 3-point shooter that's going to average 40% every single year, night in, night out, but he's definitely going to be one of the better 3-point shooters in the entire league. He can facilitate for you a bit. He plays some scrappy defense. Overall, I don't think this guy gets enough love, especially considering that he averaged not exactly all-star caliber numbers last year, but definitely numbers that put him into the conversation of potentially, they weren't, I don't know how to describe it. They weren't all-star numbers, but they were kind of close to all-star numbers if, a couple of players weren't as good as they were last year, if you know what I mean. He barely missed the mark. I guess that's the best way to describe it. And another player actually that was mentioned in our previous video that I believe needs some more credit is going to be Malik Beasley. Now he hasn't exactly played a ton of games the past couple of seasons. Obviously we had the NBA bubble and he did get suspended due to some criminal issues, but he is still an underrated NBA player regardless. He is a phenomenal off-ball player. In my opinion, is one of the most valuable offensive assets that any team could ask for in a role player. Since he's got some more production once he got into Minnesota, he's averaged pretty much 20 points a game in every single situation where he's getting 30 minutes or more per game. And as I mentioned before, his biggest strong suit is just the fact that he is so good off ball. Let's go over some of these statistics right here. So just last season, he in catch and shoots, 40% of his shots, basically 40% of his shots were in catch and shoot scenarios. And in these scenarios, he shot 41.4% from the field on some relatively high volume, 6.5 shots per game. Let's look at some of these dribble frequencies. He would take 0 dribbles 50.7% of the time. Once again, this is falling hand in hand with the catch and shoot scenarios. This led to 8.2 of his field goals in which he shot 46.1% in situations where he took 0 dribbles. Also, right here, touch time, less than 2 seconds, 62.5% of the time, 10 field goals. So 62.5% of his shots, which was 10.1 field goals attempted, he would still knock them down 45.6% of the time. When the touch time was less than 2 seconds, he would, let's go right back up to here, in a catch and shoot scenario, which was 40% of the shots that he took, 6.5 attempts per game, he shot 41.4% from the field. And in dribble scenarios, 50.7% of his shots were off of 0 dribbles, and he averaged 46.1% from the field in that range. Just some very, very good numbers, an elite off-ball threat, Oh, excuse me, my ringer is on. I will say, of course, he's not exactly the perfect player. He's not going to be a guy that goes out there and averages 6 assists a game for you, which isn't even that high if we're really talking about an elite passer. He's not going to crash the glass. He's not going to play amazing defense. But overall, in my opinion, he's a phenomenal role player for any NBA team to have, and he could really fill up the scoring stat sheet for you. Just overall doesn't get enough love for what he does. I think he is probably averaging the quietest 20 points a game that I've ever seen. Nobody really knows how many points a game he has averaged ever since he got to Minnesota, which I find ridiculous to say the least. The third player at our small forward position is going to be Gordan Hayward. Now, I will say this, Gordan Hayward is probably a bit overpaid, and this is something that I don't think enough people really talk about. When they're talking about overrated versus underrated, I think a lot of people look at a player's contract and say, oh, he's overrated. He's making $50 million a year, which I don't think any NBA player is, but we're just throwing that number out there. He makes $50 million a year, and he's only averaging 16 points a game on very average statistics, just like the most bland player ever making a ton of money. That does not necessarily mean a player is overrated. It means they are overpaid for sure, but overrated means that they are perceived as what's the word? They are lifted onto a higher pedestal than they deserve to be by many NBA fans. That is my perception of an overrated player in the NBA. And I believe that is the correct definition, obviously, of an overrated player because, well, I mean, why else would I be going by that definition if I didn't agree with it, right? That is, in my opinion, what an overrated player is in the NBA. And Gordan Hayward is not that, even though many people kind of tend to call him an overrated player. Because here's the thing, Gordan Hayward, while he does make basically $30 million a year for the next 3 seasons. He already made, obviously, his first $28.5 million this year. While he does make $30 million and his production alone doesn't provide this team $31 million in value, what he does provide this team is more attention, some potential free agents in the future, and helps make them a better team overall because Gordan Hayward is an extremely well-rounded player. He can provide you some pretty good defense. He can not exactly run your offense, but he can create for others when given the opportunity. He, of course, can crash a glass. He's been able to have pretty much ever since he got into the league. Of course, he won't ever be your leading rebounder on a team. And overall, as a scorer, people don't really realize that he averages more points than you probably think. Basically 20 points a game on pretty good efficiency, night in and night out. Just a very consistent player that comes in, does his job, basically does a little bit of everything. He's not elite in one category of basketball whatsoever, but he can come in, do basically a little bit of everything for you, and that's all you really need him to do. A perfect third option for, let's say, a contender, or a really good second option for any playoff hopeful team, and a good first option for any team, of course, that's going to be near the bottom of the league. Overall, in my opinion, just a very good, well-rounded player that doesn't really get enough love due to his contract and, of course, due to his injuries of the past. Now, moving on to our power forward. First, of course, I want to actually cover our first 3 positions, which on our underrated team, we have Malcolm Brogdon as our point guard, Malik Beasley as the shooting guard, and then Gordan Hayward as our small forward. And at the power forward, a player that I believe is slightly underrated is going to be Tobias Harris. He has consistently under Doc Rivers been able to produce at the highest levels. Doc Rivers, I don't know what he does, but he always seems to bring out the best in Tobias Harris. This guy was one of, as you can see, 5 players that barely missed the mark on 50, 40, 90 this season, shooting 51% from the field, 39.4% from 3, and 89.2% from the free throw line. Very efficient scoring from a guy that was basically this team's second option as far as scoring goes, even though many people perceive Ben Simmons to be this team's true second option. I don't really believe it, and the stats don't exactly back it up. Just some very efficient scoring from him, and he doesn't really get enough love in that aspect. And I also want to say he is this team's closer. Joel Embiid is phenomenal. Joel Embiid is this team's superstar. He can go out there and get you 40 points a game, but when you have 12 seconds left on the shot clock and you need a bucket to go in from anywhere on the floor, nobody else on this team can really do that like Tobias Harris. Does that mean that he is some phenomenal player in the clutch that can create for himself and knock down a mid-range jumper to win the game? Not at all. But it does mean that when this team is in that sort of situation, who do they look to? Tobias Harris. He is going to be that guy for them. And I think that I'm not going to say he's the best clutch player whatsoever in the league, but he's been able to consistently, on a relatively consistent basis, pull through for this team in a clutch situation like that. He's been able to take over many games for this team when, let's say, Ben Simmons isn't pulling his weight, or Joel Embiid has been injured, or he isn't pulling his weight. Harris consistently has been able to come through this season. He was able to do it the season before last. I believe last year personally might have just been a down year, and we're kind of seeing a rebounding year, or a rebound in his career trajectory overall from where he was last season. A guy that really just doesn't get enough love or enough talk, in my opinion. That's Tobias Harris. And the final player in our starting lineup for the underrated team is going to be Clint Capela. Not much to say about this guy. He's going to crash the glass, averaged almost 15, or we'll say 14. He averaged 14 rebounds a game this year, and was also blocking, I believe, 2 shots a game. As you can see right here, was second overall in defensive Raptor at plus 5.2, which is overall extremely, extremely good. I don't have too much to say about this guy. He finishes well around the rim and can give you like 15 points a game. He crashes the glass at an elite level, almost averaged, I believe, 5 offensive rebounds a game, which is kind of crazy in and of itself. And then, of course, has also always been a consistent rim protector wherever he goes. I really like him overall. He kind of fits basically on any NBA team. And as you can kind of tell from what I just said, from the starting 5, a lot of times these guys just kind of go in there, do their thing, and are just very good at it. They're very consistent, and that's something that I love about them. Now, the one player that I really had in mind that I didn't mention on this team is Spencer Dinwiddie. The only reason I believe he is underrated is because of his injury. He didn't get to play this year, so people kind of forgot about him. And of course, with KD, Kyrie, and James Harden all coming back, or not coming back, but coming to the Brooklyn Nets roster, they, of course, outshined a guy like Spencer Dinwiddie, who the season before averaged, I believe, 20-6 on a team that actually made the playoffs for the first time in however many years, and of course was a very efficient player while doing so. Of course, he did get injured this year, so maybe he's not quite as good as he was last year, but I honestly think that he could definitely do that, especially considering what we saw from him in the few games, of course, that we did see him play last season. He also looks incredible on defense in comparison to seasons prior. He was never a bad defender, to say the least. Wasn't like a guy that you looked at and said he can't defend anybody, but he stepped it up in a major way. He was a very versatile guy those first couple of games this season, and hopefully he can still do the same thing once again coming back from injury. Now, moving on to the All-NBA overrated team. I'm going to probably get a good amount of hate for this, but it is going to be Jamal Murray as my starting point guard on this team. I want to say this when it comes to the overrated teams. I'm not looking to throw guys like Dennis Schroeder, Kristaps Porzingis, Kyle Kuzma, or Rudy Gobert in this conversation, because the thing is, once everybody starts to say, hey, they're overrated, and everybody is saying they're overrated, they aren't really as overrated as everybody is now saying, because everybody knows they aren't quite as good as we used to perceive them to be. So none of those guys that I just mentioned will be on this list for that reason. And that means I had to do a little bit of digging. And that means that a guy like Jamal Murray, who really isn't that overrated in my opinion, but still, honestly, maybe he's not the best example, because I do think that Jamal Murray is a bit overrated. But a couple of guys on this list I didn't really think are crazy overrated, but I needed somebody to fill in on this roster, or I needed them to fulfill a position on this roster. And it's kind of like, you are the only person that comes to mind. This does not mean that they are a bad player whatsoever, including Jamal Murray. He's still a phenomenal player and would drop 100 points on me in 2 minutes if we ever played one-on-one. But overall, I think people put him on a higher pedestal than he deserves to be, and that's why he's going to be my starting point guard here. Now, as you can see from the statistics, then right here, 21, 4, and 5, that's not bad whatsoever. But the thing with Jamal Murray is he is not consistent. Something I mentioned with all those underrated players is that they are very consistent. But here is my thing with Jamal Murray. Your second option should not come out here and drop 8 points, 11 points, 3 points. Where is it? 5 points, 9 points, stuff like that. Those are games that I don't want my second option to have. That was always my biggest drawback with Chris Middleton as a second option, was the fact that he could not consistently score for this team. But then Jamal Murray comes out and drops 35, then 50 and 30. And it's absolutely, oh my gosh. Sorry about that. And it's absolutely ridiculous, right? He has some insane games. I just can't stand the fact that he's inconsistent. I think that he is, of course, not a very good defender, which doesn't help his case very much at all. And I think that too many people still look at him and say he's Bubble Murray, when in reality, he is not. Nobody is as good as they were in the bubble. And that, in my opinion, is just a matter of fact. No hate towards Jamal Murray really whatsoever, but I don't think that he is consistent enough to be a really good second option, in my opinion. I used to say the same thing about Chris Middleton, and they just won a championship in Milwaukee. So maybe Jamal Murray can come in and prove me wrong soon, but I've not been proven wrong yet. I've been saying this for, I want to say 1 or 2 years now. It's the inconsistency from him that has been my biggest issue. And of course, the lack of defense just kind of pushes him further up the overrated list just slightly for me. And for that reason, I'm going to be having him as my starting point guard today. Second player on the list is going to be Tim Hardaway Jr. Overall, I mean, he's not a guy that people look at and say, oh, he's an all-star caliber player. He's a phenomenal guy. He does this, he does that. He's great overall. Nobody really looks at Tim Hardaway and says that. But the thing about Tim Hardaway is a lot of people look at him and say he can be a second option on a really good team. He can be a third option on a really good team. He can create for himself. And guess what? None of that is true. If you do look at the statistics, point blank, 16.5 points, shooting 44.7% from the field and 39.1% from three, that's pretty good. Not bad whatsoever. He also crashes the glass a little bit with 3.3 rebounds. Not really terrible statistics whatsoever until you get to this. The fact that 69%, but 70% of this player's made shots, Tim Hardaway, 70% of his shots were all assisted, meaning he did not create those opportunities for himself most of the time. I'm not going to say all the time because players can cut to the basket and that leads to an assist. That means that they did create for himself, but he cannot create an open shot for himself very well or on a very consistent basis. Like I believe many people or a good amount of NBA fans perceive him to be able to do, because he did have a couple of years, the main one obviously being this year right here where he was traded from New York to Dallas, where he was able to create a bit for himself and looked like a legitimate second or third option on a potential playoff team, when in reality, I don't think that he is all that because of the fact that he just really can't create for himself. And then, of course, if you really want to go into it, he's not a phenomenal defender. He can't really create for others not whatsoever, but really can't create for others at a high level. He doesn't crash the glass. Really, the only thing that he can provide you is scoring. And it's not like he's an elite off-ball talent, like I mentioned before with Malik Beasley. He's not a guy that can create for himself at a high level. So he's kind of just, in my opinion, this pretty inconsistent guy that you can't really rely on most of the time, like to create his own shot or to create for others or anything like that. And real briefly, I do want to say he's also just an inconsistent player. If you thought that Jamal Murray was bad as far as inconsistency goes, Tim Hardaway Jr., in my opinion, is much, much worse because he'll come out here and drop 19, then he'll drop 4, then he'll drop 5, then he'll drop 26, then he'll drop 7. And it's very back and forth the entire season, whereas Jamal Murray kind of goes in spurts where he averages 40 points a game for a week, then only averages 18, and one of those games was like a really inefficient 5-point game. I'm going a little bit off topic, but Tim Hardaway Jr. overall, pretty inconsistent player and doesn't really provide much for you outside of scoring, in which case he's not all that, in my opinion. Fourth player on this team. Actually, did I skip a position? Oh, yeah. A couple of guys that I'm going to mention for the small forward position. This is what I was mentioning before when I said that there's not really any guys that I can find for this position. For the small forward position overall, not a ton of guys that I think are overrated, but some guys I'm going to mention are going to be RJ Barrett, Michael Porter Jr., and the final guy is going to be Anthony Edwards. I'll cover all of them really briefly here. Sorry about that. Overall, RJ Barrett, nothing really against him. I believe that overall this year, his three-point shooting numbers were inflated along with many other people's this year. He went from 32% to 40%. And I believe the biggest reason for that is the fact that we had very small, if not no crowds whatsoever. And similar to the bubble, we found that meant that players were able to shoot much more efficiently than they did in seasons previous. And outside of his scoring numbers, I don't think that RJ Barrett improved really in any one area whatsoever in a drastic way, besides defense. I do think he stepped it up, obviously, on the defensive side of the ball a lot under Tom Thibodeau. And people are kind of looking at him saying, oh, he's going to take over the team. At some point, he'll be the leader. I don't really see that with him. I think he'll be a good third or second option. So that's why he's on this list. Anthony Edwards, I've kind of been off on since day one. He's just in a similar category with, I guess, Tim Hardaway Jr. and Jamal Murray. Very inconsistent scorer, was extremely inefficient to begin the year, and then, of course, had some insane stretches throughout the rest of his rookie season that kind of brought his averages up. But at one point, he was averaging about 34% from the field and like 21% from three, and he's kind of brought those numbers up to, I believe, 40 and 30 something. Which once again aren't really exactly elite efficiency numbers, but they're better, of course, than 34 and 21%. I'm not a huge fan of that. I like guys that, once again, are consistent, that are efficient, and maybe he's going to improve and become a more efficient scorer. But I'm not really going to guarantee that, because that was one of his biggest criticisms coming out of college, was the fact that he kind of took stupid shots, was playing hero ball, and was shooting very inefficient basketball. And Michael Porter Jr., I love Michael Porter Jr. overall, but people are looking at him and saying, oh, he's this phenomenal player that can create for himself. He's this guy that's going to average 30 points a game next season. And I don't believe either one of those things. Actually, I know for a fact neither one of those is true. Michael Porter Jr. is an elite off-ball talent right now who could eventually become a fantastic creator for himself, but he hasn't exactly shown those skills yet on the NBA floor. Most of the time, it's been pull-ups from mid-range. It's been dribble pull-ups from mid-range or from three, attacking the basket, cutting to the basket. Not a lot of, step back, spinning around players, hesitations, ISO ball opportunities where he's creating a shot for himself. We haven't really seen that. Now, I don't think it's really his fault, but it is a fault overall on his ranking, if we were to word it that way. Once again, I love Michael Porter Jr., but he is a little bit overrated at the small forward position for me. Fourth player, I'm not going to talk about him pretty much whatsoever at the power forward position. It's going to be Ben Simmons. I covered him in the last video. If you really wanted to watch that and you want to get more information on him, if you don't know anything about it already, go ahead and watch that video. And the final player on my starting five for the overrated team is going to be Andre Drummond. His style of play just no longer really fits, obviously, in today's style of NBA. Back to the basket, post up big man who, in my opinion, isn't necessarily stat padding or chasing statistics like a guy like Hassan Whiteside does, but he's very Hassan Whiteside-ish, where his stats don't mean much. I'm not a guy that believes heavily in empty stats for guys like, let's say, Zach LaVine, Trae Young, or Devin Booker, just last year. I don't believe in that sort of stuff. But when it comes to a guy like Andre Drummond, in a sense, I believe in empty stats. I don't think that he provides your team much value. I don't think he plays team basketball or winning basketball. I think he puts up empty stats. And once again, his play style is just no longer not relevant, but it is becoming less and less relevant in the NBA as three-point shooting obviously gets more popular. And whenever he gets signed or traded to a new team, people kind of act like, oh, this is some huge move. This is going to level up the team that he joins so much, when in reality, it's not, in my opinion, it's really not that big of a move. It's relatively big, but it's nothing groundbreaking or game-changing whatsoever, at least to me. The final player that I do have on this list overall for overrated players is just going to be Reggie Jackson and D'Angelo Russell. Reggie Jackson has always been an inconsistent player and an inefficient player. He had a really good postseason run, but I don't think that he's going to do that all next season. If he does, congrats to him, but he's never really shown me that he can do that in recent memory. And D'Angelo Russell, honestly, isn't that overrated, but I thought I should just briefly mention him because of the fact that he has been injured, so I don't want to criticize the guy too much. But I think too many people think that he's still the same player that he was, or plays like the same player that he was back in the Brooklyn days, where he was an all-star. I don't really think he's kind of all that anymore. He's not quite as, what's the word? He's not quite as consistent, in my opinion. I guess that's been my word of the day today, but he's really just not been that consistent. He doesn't play phenomenal defense. Overall, I don't have too much to say about D'Angelo Russell, but like I said, I just felt that he should be briefly mentioned in this video. So overall, that's all I had for you guys today. We'll go over the teams real quick one more time. In my underrated team, my starting five was Malcolm Brogdon, Malik Beasley, Gordan Hayward, Why am I forgetting this? Gordan Hayward, Tobias Harris, and Clint Capela. And then after that, my overrated team was going to be Jamal Murray, not D'Angelo Russell, Jamal Murray, Tim Hardaway Jr., RJ Barrett, Anthony Edwards, or Michael Porter Jr., whoever you really want to throw in there, Ben Simmons, and Andre Drummond. I hope you guys enjoyed this episode of Jump Ball, and I will see you tomorrow. Thank you.